So last episode, I left off with the rise of the dime novels and the rise of what came to be known as the pulps. Now, I found myself wondering what is the difference between a dime novel and a pulp? And actually, there is a distinct difference between them. Namely, the pulps are cheaper. They developed a new process in the early 20th century that allowed for the making of paper out of wood pulp. So that made it a lot easier and a lot cheaper to print what came to be known as the pulp magazines. Pulp magazines were half the price of a dime novel, so they were only a nickel. At the height of their popularity, there were over 250 pulp magazine titles out there being published, so that led to about 20 million words of new fiction being produced every month. Now, there were all kinds of genres. They had romance, they had westerns, they had crime. Some of the more popular pulps, some of the ones that we actually know and think of whenever we say the word pulp magazine, were centered around certain central characters, like the Shadow or like Doc Savage. These central pulp characters, these crime fighters, went on to influence comic books and the rise of the superhero. But again, that's another podcast and that's another really YouTube channel altogether. I'm going to touch on two pulp magazines in particular for their importance to the genre. The first is Weird Tales. Started in 1923, Weird Tales came to specialize in a genre called, originally enough, weird fiction. Weird fiction is a hodgepodge of horror and fantasy. It was a term for the fantasy genre before anyone really called it the fantasy genre. Now, a whole bunch of people wrote for Weird Tales, but there are two authors in particular that we still know and read today. The first one, H.P. Lovecraft. He's a guy who came up with the Cthulhu mythos. He's basically one of the forefathers of cosmic horror, a subgenre about how inconsequential and powerless man is. It's very nihilistic, very existential. I may do a full episode on it later. The other guy we're going to talk about is Robert E. Howard. You know Howard already from Conan the Barbarian, but he wrote a whole bunch of stuff in a whole bunch of different genres with a whole bunch of different characters. But Robert E. Howard really was the forefather of another subgenre known as sword and sorcery. And sword and sorcery, basically, whenever you have a big, muscly guy killing bad guys and wrestling snakes, anything that would be in a Frank Frazetta painting, that's sword and sorcery right there. I'll probably go ahead and do another episode on the swords and sorcery subgenre later, but for now, let's just keep on rolling. So, on the science fiction side of things, you have a gentleman by the name of Hugo Gernsback, and Hugo went ahead and started the first science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, in 1926. Amazing Stories had somewhat of a rough start. They kind of had trouble, paying their authors on time, but it stuck around, and over the years, it came to be a huge influence on the genre. And because of that, that is why we have a somewhat controversial award nowadays known as the Hugo. The pulps are important to the genre for a lot of reasons. For one, they were popular. Lots of people read them, and lots of people wanted to read more stuff like them. On top of that, pulps were written for adults, or at least for kids who could somehow get their hands on a copy without their parents knowing. They were violent and lurid, and they had pictures of scantily clad women on the cover, and this all drove sales, and this is all why they were super popular. This is a real far contrast from earlier fantasies like Peter Pan or Oz that were geared more for children. It's because of pulp magazines like Weird Tales that you can turn on Game of Thrones on Sunday nights and see a whole bunch of boobs and blood. Isn't that great? As history has shown us time and time again, every boom eventually comes to a bust, and the pulps were no exception. By the 1940s, business was beginning to slow down, a lot of pulp magazines went out of business for one reason or another, and then paper rationing during World War II really didn't help. But even as the pulp magazine format began to die, the genre would live on, and in the 40s and 50s you get into what's known as the golden age of science fiction. Meanwhile, in fantasy, there was this guy named Tolkien. You might have heard about him. We'll talk about him next time, too.